lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm bringing you a brand new series on this channel which is called The 8 That Are Great, and this is basically just going to be a video where I'm giving you 8 book recommendations that are grouped under a particular genre or kind of sub-genre. So today's one in particular is going to be talking about history non-fiction books, but I will have a lot more coming out over the next kind of couple of months and sort of going forward. So if you have a particular genre that you would desperately like to see, feel free to leave some suggestions down below and I'll see what I can get out kind of more quickly than others. Also, just very quickly, I am hosting a history non-fiction readathon with some wonderful co-hosts, and these books today will fulfill the prompt of one of the hosts' favourite books. Should you be interested in joining with that readathon, if it is before the 17th of August basically, at time of you viewing this, so feel free to join in with that. All the information will be down below. I'm not going to be talking about any paleontology or prehistoric books today. It is more about kind of more contemporaneous than I tend to normally read history books, because I will have a separate video entirely about paleontology coming out at some point soon-ish, not before the readathon however. Okay, with all of that preamble out of the way, let's jump in and talk about some of the books. The first one I want to talk about is All a Game by Tristan Donovan. This is a micro history about the history of board games in particular, and this is a really lovely, fun, light-hearted history book that really kind of laughs in the face of the idea that history has to be dull or boring or all about just like military and war stuff. Each individual chapter looks at either a specific board game or like subgenre of board games, and it kind of takes you through loosely from ancient all the way to kind of contemporary board games and the revival of them with things like plastic and things like that. We look at chess, we look at some of the most early examples of board games, and it really is a wonderful way of looking at kind of what on a social level was important to people at the time and what different values get expressed through the board games, because the things that we choose to do with our leisure time are an important reflection of what we value as a community. Also, the discussion of the increase in leisure time or decrease in leisure time dependent on what different systems were in place and where you were within class is also discussing this as like what was important at the time, what was popular at the time. Really good fun, really fascinating, very light-hearted and very quick read. The next book I have to talk about is Sea People, The Puzzle of Polynesia by Christina Thompson. This is In Search of the Ancient Navigators of the Pacific. This is looking specifically at the Polynesian Triangle, which is a collection of islands over quite a very large area, which are a collection of people known as the Polynesian culture, and it's about how do people even get to these islands sort of in, again, prehistory, and also how these cultures developed and how they interacted with various explorers who have come across their shores across history. It's both a wonderful snapshot of the Polynesian culture and the different way that kind of culture has developed on these different islands, but also how we have interacted with things like anthropology and history and how we've kind of understood them historically. What have been the important trends and traits that we've used within history? I think it's a really, really cool and fascinating book. It looks at things like the preference of written records compared to oral histories and sort of a lot of the kind of judgments that get laid into that about concepts of like what does it count to be civilized. It's also looking at a lot of the very like race-based science that kind of came out around sort of the 18th century. It's also looking at kind of the linguistic trends that we can track and how you can use linguistics to track methods of transportation and kind of the travel in history. It's just generally a really, really fascinating book that covers a huge range of different bits of information. The next one I have to talk about is The Butchering Art by Lindsey Fitzharris. This is a little bit shorter than the other two, so might be quite a nice one to pop in there if you don't fancy picking up a big hefty tome of a book. This is specifically about Joseph Lister and his quest to transform the grisly world of Victorian medicine. So Joseph Lister was a really big advocate for antiseptic, and it was his discovery about antisepsis that then led to a lot of different advancements within medicine, but was also his battle of trying to get people to understand this concept. His discovery comes off the back of the discovery of anaesthetic, which really changed the game for surgery and instead meant that his desire for cleanliness becomes, and also for keeping a sterile environment and what that means, becomes something that you can actually physically do, because you're not trying to do this like hack and sawbone style slap and dash sort of run that you would have to do with surgery before anaesthetic, because basically you had until the patient went into shock and died from like blood loss whilst you were performing your surgery, because you didn't really have any way to knock them out. It's generally really fascinating, and I love medical history, and I think this is a wonderful blend of history of medicine but also biography of a very interesting man. smashed together. We're now going to take a brief foray into the world of art history, and for modern art we're going to be looking at What Are You Looking At? 150 Years of Modern Art in the Blink of an Eye by Will Gompertz. This is a hugely comprehensive guide to the history of modern art, starting with the pre-Raphaelite era going all the way up to modern day. It is jam-packed full of information and covers all the isms you could possibly think of, from surrealism to cubism, looking at both like how the artists were inspired, how the various movements informed each other, but also what was going on politically and socially that ended up informing these movements. Because, you know, life imitates art and art imitates life. These artists are responding and trying to say something about their world. It features some big names that you're going to know, like Andy Warhol, etc., but also some of the smaller artists that you may not know of, and also the smaller movements. It is such an extensive book that I really think it's one that you probably do need to read quite slowly or potentially multiple times, and I do think it's also really helpful to have access to something like Google Images whilst you're reading it, because this book references an insane number of artists that you're going to want to be like looking at what their work is, and there's no way to possibly include all of them in this. There are a few pictures in the middle, but it's not going to be enough. Like, it barely covers what is covered in one single chapter. I also can't actually remember off the top of my head how well Will Gompertz does for including basically anybody who doesn't fit in with the classic like white male artist stereotype, because I have read this a few years ago and I was less aware of that within my reading at the time of reading it. So it's just something to bear in mind, that I can't personally comment right now about how well it represents anybody apart from the dead white artist. So that's just worth bearing in mind. It's one that I will get around to rereading again at some point, but I have so many other art history books that I'm excited about on my shelves that it's kind of like hard to prioritize getting back to that one when there's so much like new content I want to read. On the note of another art history book, this is Desperate Romantics: The Private Lives of the Pre-Raphaelites by Franny Moyle. As the title suggests, this is about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, who were a collection of artists who were basically putting out work in the time of the Victorian era, and it's a look at their private lives because they really were some of the original concepts like celebrity and rock star, and also their muses were considered some of the earliest examples of the concept of like a supermodel as a celebrity. So really, really fascinating and just so much fun. Like, it's almost like a soap opera in a book. There's cheating and scandal and running off of each other's wives, and generally a lot of dramatic stuff happening, as well as some really interesting information about their art and also about what was happening within Victorian England. If you want another book that talks about Victorian England that is also both a combination of a social history and something else as well, then you definitely have to check out The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. This is a hugely popular book that has won multiple prizes and been nominated for many more, and it is basically about the 5 women that Jack the Ripper killed. It is about giving them back a voice and a commentary on the obsession with focusing on killers rather than victims, and the way that victims end up just propping up this idea of the mad genius, the terrifying, cold, calculating killer, and the way that Jack the Ripper has really been mythologized in our society. But it also doubles as a really, really interesting look at social history for what it was like to be a Victorian woman in Victorian era, and also more importantly like a working class woman, because a lot of these women ended up on the streets in some way. It's also putting forward the argument that basically it's generally been accepted that these women were prostitutes at the time of their death, and it is putting forward the argument that we really don't have any major evidence for that apart from for one of them, and we have no evidence that she was actually still practicing at her time of her death, and the obsession with trying to paint them as prostitutes and what that really says about us as a society. It is an incredible book, and I definitely recommend the audiobook in particular. I think it is really beautifully narrated. Another one talking about around the time of Victorian history, maybe a fraction earlier than that, is The Fossil Hunter by Shelley Emling. This is a biography about a woman called Mary Anning, who really contributed a lot to the study of paleontology, very much at the beginning of that as a science, and found some of the earliest examples of plesiosaurs, which is a species, like a subgroup of animals who were alive in the time of the dinosaurs but were not technically dinosaurs. Her work and her kind of contribution to science has classically obviously been overlooked because she was merely a woman, and this book is about trying to give her back a voice and a story. She worked with some of the really great scientists of the day in her time, and her discoveries really helped to put various ideas on the map. Paleontology as a concept, how that interacted with our understandings of how old the world was, how that interacted with religion, and sparked some of the early ideas for Darwin and the idea of evolution basically. So she was super influential, both in terms of for paleontology but also just for history of ideas in science at the time. Shelley Emling's biography is wonderful and really looks back at her life, and one thing I really appreciated about it was it was very good at acknowledging where we didn't have accurate or up-to-date information about Mary Annie's life, because those records have been lost or were never made in the first place, because classically speaking women have generally been overlooked in history, so there just isn't as much information available on them because nobody thought to write any of this stuff down. So she does a really good job of kind of making a discussion about that as well as looking at Mary Anning's life. And the final book that I want to talk about is A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of Virginia Hall, World War II's Most Dangerous Spy by Sonia Purnell. This, again, as the subtitle suggests, is a biography of Virginia Hall, who was a very, very prolific spy who was working within France in World War II, really helping to set up the French resistance and doing a lot of work for the Allies. She's an American spy who spent a lot of her time over in Europe, and she was also really interesting because she actually had a disability where the lower half of one of her legs was missing due to an accident early on in her life. Her work has been kind of very overlooked historically, and she really was kind of a pioneer who did so much important work and helped so many people, especially in the early years of the war when France was occupied by Germany. This is a really lovely book, although I do agree with some people's criticisms that similar to Mary Anning, we don't have necessarily the most complete records on her, but unlike the Mary Anning book, Sonia Purnell is not necessarily the best at acknowledging where we don't have accurate records, and she's kind of having to fill in the gaps. I listened to this on audiobook narrated by Juliet Stevenson, which is really, really, really lovely, so I would personally recommend it in that format as well if you are somebody who does enjoy audiobooks. But I thought it was a lovely way of looking at a different kind of book about World War II, focused on spies and again the role of a woman in this time, and also what it was like to be in France in the time of the occupation, which again is something that has a tendency to be overlooked. So there you have it. Those are 8 history non-fiction books that I just think are really pretty great. So do let me know if you're going to be joining in with the readathon and if you will be picking any of these books for the prompt of host's favourite book. Like I said in my announcement video, you can use anything basically that I've mentioned on this channel before that I've mentioned vaguely positively, and please do remember all of the various paleontology and prehistoric books that I love. I will link the video down below for some of the natural history recommendations I have put out in the past, and I will be doing a dedicated video on them at some point, but I have a few more on my list that I desperately want to read before doing that video, so it won't be for a couple of months yet. If you have any particular genres that you'd like to see for this little kind of mini series of 8 that are great, let me know in the comments down below. And yeah, that's about it really. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye!